Just for today, would you pretend to be my son? She was 90 years old, 5'2", barely 110 pounds, and she was standing in front of 6 Hell's Angels, trembling so hard her purse shook against her chest, looking the most dangerous man in the room dead in the eyes. Every person in that diner stopped breathing. The bikers didn't move. Nobody moved. Because what this woman just asked, and what those men did next, broke something open that no one in that room would ever be able to put back together. Her grandnephew was 13 minutes away. He was coming to steal everything she had. He had no idea what he was walking into. If this story moves you, subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Dorothy Hale's hands hadn't stopped shaking in 3 weeks. Not the gentle tremor of a woman who'd earned every one of her 90 years. This was different. This was the kind of shaking that starts deep in the bones, the kind that comes from lying awake at 3 in the morning, knowing someone you trusted is circling your life like a vulture, waiting for you to stop moving. She sat in the same window booth she'd sat in for longer than most people in this town had been alive. Rosie's Trailside Diner, Route 9, just east of Bozeman, Montana. Her cup of tea sat untouched in front of her, going cold, and her eyes were fixed on the parking lot like she was watching a door she knew would open any minute. A door she couldn't lock. Annie Dawson noticed. Annie always noticed. 34 years old, brown hair pulled back in a loose knot, hands that never stopped moving. She'd been working at Rosie's since she was 26, the day she stepped off a one-way bus with a duffel bag and nothing else. Rosie, the original owner, had looked her up and down that morning and said 5 words. Monday, 6 a.m., don't be late. That was 8 years ago. Rosie was in Florida now. Annie ran the place in everything but name. She knew every regular's order before they opened their mouth. She knew who was having a bad day by how they stirred their coffee. She knew when someone was hurting, even when they smiled. It was a gift. It was also a curse. Because 3 weeks ago, Annie had started watching Dorothy Hale fall apart in slow motion, and she hadn't been able to do a damn thing about it. Dorothy had been coming to Rosie's for decades, white hair pinned in a careful bun, a blue cardigan in every season, and eyes that could slice through nonsense like a blade through warm butter. She was the kind of woman who made a room sit up straighter just by walking into it. Sharp, dignified, unbreakable, until Kevin showed up. Kevin Hale, Dorothy's grandnephew, 46 years old, sandy brown hair, perfect teeth, a handshake so rehearsed it felt like a contract being executed. He wore pressed chinos and a sport coat to a roadside diner and still managed to look like he was closing a deal. He'd started coming 3 weeks ago, always the same time, always with a brown leather portfolio tucked under his arm, always sitting across from Dorothy in that window booth, leaning close, speaking low. Annie couldn't catch the words, but she could read the room. She watched how Dorothy's shoulders curled inward every time Kevin spoke. She watched Dorothy's hand hover over whatever paper he slid across the table, hovering, trembling, but never signing. She watched Kevin's polished smile tighten at the corners each time that hand pulled back. And she watched how, every single time he stood to leave, he said the same words. "We're running out of time, Aunt Dorothy. This is for your own good." For your own good. Those 5 words hit Annie like a fist to the sternum. She'd heard them before, different voice, different life, but always, always from someone who meant the exact opposite. She didn't sleep well those weeks. She kept turning it over. What was she supposed to do? She was a waitress. She had no money, no connections, no power. She didn't even know a lawyer. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself she was reading too much into it. She told herself Dorothy was a grown woman who could handle her own affairs. But every time she told herself that, she saw Dorothy's hands shaking, and the lie tasted like ash in her mouth. Then came Tuesday, 6 days before everything blew apart. It was a slow afternoon. Dorothy sat in her booth. Kevin sat across from her. And this time, he'd brought reinforcements. A woman, tall, thin, blonde highlights, designer sunglasses perched on her head like a crown she'd awarded herself. Megan, Kevin's wife. She walked into Rosie's like she was stepping into a building she planned to buy and demolish. Annie was restocking supplies behind the partition that separated the dining area from the storage hallway. Close enough to hear. Close enough that her hands froze the moment Megan's voice rose above a whisper. The doctor's assessment is already filed. Megan's tone was flat, clinical, the voice of someone reading off a balance sheet. All we need is the signature on the power of attorney. Then we move forward with the sale. Annie's blood went cold. Dorothy's voice came back thin, fragile, the voice of a woman being squeezed from all sides and running out of room to breathe. I don't understand why I need to sell my home, Kevin answered, gentle on the surface, steel underneath, the way a trap looks soft right before it snaps shut. Because you can't take care of yourself anymore. That's what the doctor's report says. That's what the court will say if we go that route. A pause. We don't want strangers deciding your future, do we? But I feel fine, Megan cut in, sharp, final, like a door slamming. The house is worth $1.4 million with the new bypass going in. If we wait, the market shifts. This is the window. You sign, we handle everything. You move into assisted living where you'll be safe. This isn't complicated. $1.4 million. Annie's hands went still on the stack of napkins she was holding. There it was, not care, not concern, not family looking out for family. A payday. A cold, calculated million-dollar payday built on the bones of a 90-year-old woman's life. The appointment with the judge is Monday, Kevin continued, smooth, practiced, like he'd rehearsed this speech in front of a mirror. If you sign the power of attorney today, we handle it quietly. No court, no strangers, just family taking care of family. He paused, and then he turned the knife. If you don't sign, we file the competency petition. A court decides. Either way, Dorothy, this is happening. Silence. Long, suffocating silence. Then Dorothy spoke, and her voice was the saddest sound Annie Dawson had ever heard in her life. Your mother was my niece. She would never have done this to me. Annie pressed her back against the wall behind the partition. Her eyes were stinging. Another silence. Then Kevin, colder now, the gentleness stripped away like paint peeling off a rotting wall. My mother isn't here, Aunt Dorothy. I am, and I'm trying to help you. Annie heard the folder close. She heard chairs scrape back against the floor. She heard footsteps moving toward the door. And then she heard something that cracked her chest wide open. Dorothy crying. Not loud, not dramatic. The quiet, shattered, suffocating kind of crying that comes from someone who has just realized, truly realized, that they are completely and utterly alone. That the last person in the world who shares their blood has turned that blood into a weapon. Annie stood behind that partition for a full minute, holding napkins, shaking, tears running down her own face. She didn't sleep that night, or the next. At 2 a.m, she sat on the floor of her apartment with her phone in her hand and typed "elder financial abuse" into the search bar. She read for hours, story after story that sounded exactly like Dorothy's. Families draining assets, doctors who signed whatever they were paid to sign, old people losing everything, their homes, their money, their dignity, their freedom, to the very people who were supposed to protect them. And in almost every story, the same ending. By the time anyone noticed, it was already too late. Monday was 4 days away. Annie didn't have 4 days. Dorothy didn't have 4 days. Wednesday came and went. Annie worked her shift in a fog. She refilled coffees. She wiped tables. She smiled at the regulars. And the entire time, her mind was a storm with no walls. What could she do? Go to the police? And say what? She was a waitress who overheard a conversation. Kevin was a polished, well-dressed man with a doctor's report and legal paperwork. Who would they believe? She thought about confronting Kevin directly. She imagined walking up to him and saying, "I know what you're doing." And then she imagined Kevin's lawyer filing a harassment suit against a waitress with no savings and no safety net, and she felt sick. She thought about telling Dorothy she'd heard everything. But what good was that? Dorothy already knew what Kevin was doing. Dorothy was living it. Wednesday night, Annie sat in her apartment and stared at the ceiling for 4 hours straight. She went through every option, every path, every door, and every single one was locked. Thursday morning, she drove to work before dawn. The sky was still dark. The road was empty. She unlocked the diner, started the coffee, set out the mugs, and told herself that today was just another day. But it wasn't, and she knew it, because today was Thursday. And on Thursdays, the Hells Angels came. The Harleys pulled in at 11:15, same as always. 6 bikes, 6 men. The rumble was the kind you felt in your ribs before your ears caught up. They parked in a perfect diagonal row outside the diner, and when those boots hit the gravel, the building held its breath. Bear led the way. Real name, Sam Garrison. 59 years old, broad-shouldered, a thick salt and pepper beard that looked like it had survived weather most people only see in documentaries. Hands the size of dinner plates, a voice like stones rolling downhill. He'd been riding for over 30 years, president of the local chapter for the last 14. Annie didn't know much about his past, and she'd never asked, but she knew one thing. Bear had a code, and he lived by that code the way other men breathe, without thinking, without stopping, without exception. Behind him came Boone, 6'5", quiet as his own shadow, the kind of man who took up a room just by standing still. Then Earl, the oldest at 65, always wearing reading glasses that looked absurd on a face like cracked granite. Jax, the youngest at 32, always cracking jokes nobody laughed at and never seeming to care. Colt, lean, sharp-eyed, the one who noticed everything before anyone else in the room even looked up. And Stonewall, who never spoke unless it mattered. And when he did, people stopped breathing to listen. They filed in. They took their booth. Annie brought coffee, black, 6 cups, same as always. She set them down one at a time, and then she paused, because Dorothy was here, sitting in her window booth, alone, hands clasped in her lap, knuckles white, tea untouched, eyes staring at nothing and everything at the same time. Annie looked at Dorothy. She looked at the bikers, and something inside her chest shifted. Not a thought, not a plan, something deeper. Something that had been building for 3 weeks and now pressed against her ribs, like a fist trying to punch its way out. Not yet, she told herself. Wait. She went back to the counter. She refilled ketchup bottles. She wiped down the pie case. She watched the clock. She watched Dorothy. 20 minutes passed. And then Dorothy did something that stopped Annie's heart. The old woman stood up. Slowly, deliberately, the way someone stands when they've made a decision that terrifies them to the core of their being, but they're going to see it through anyway, because the alternative is worse. She picked up her purse, that worn brown leather purse she'd been carrying for God knows how many decades. She clutched it to her chest like a shield, and she walked, not toward the door, not toward the counter, not toward the restroom, toward the bikers. Annie's hand froze on the ketchup bottle. Walt and Jean, 2 retired ranchers at the counter who'd been eating the same lunch here since before the internet existed, stopped chewing mid-bite. A young couple in the far booth looked up from their phones. Marco, the cook, leaned out from the kitchen window, a spatula frozen in midair. Everyone watched. Everyone. Because a 90-year-old woman, 5'2", barely 110 pounds, was walking directly towards 6 Hells Angels. 1 step, Then another, then another. Her shoes made no sound on the floor, but every step thundered through that room like a heartbeat. She reached their table. She stood there. The bikers looked up. Bear looked up. Their eyes met. And Dorothy Hale, this tiny woman who had survived a husband's death, a niece's death, a lifetime of Montana winters, and a grandnephew who wanted to strip her of everything she had, opened her mouth and said 7 words. "Just for today, would you pretend to be my son?" The diner didn't go quiet. It went dead. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Annie felt tears sting her eyes, and she didn't fully understand why. Not yet. But her body understood. Her body knew what her mind hadn't caught up to, that she was witnessing something she would carry for the rest of her life. Bear stared at Dorothy. His face didn't change. His body didn't move. But something behind his eyes shifted. Something deep. Something tectonic. Something buried under 30 years of highway miles and hard choices and things he'd never told anyone. No one at that table spoke. Boone glanced at Bear. Earl set his coffee down with a careful hand. Jax's half-formed joke died in his throat. Colt's sharp eyes went soft for the first time Annie had ever seen. Stonewall looked at the old woman's trembling hands and then looked away, jaw tight. Bear's voice, when it finally came, was quieter than Annie had ever heard it. "Why?" One word. That's all he gave her. But it wasn't cold. It wasn't dismissal. It was the voice of a man who needed to understand before he could move. A man who didn't waste words and who didn't give his loyalty to anyone who hadn't earned it, but who also didn't turn away from someone standing in front of him, shaking like a leaf. Dorothy's chin quivered. She gripped her purse tighter. "Because my grandnephew is coming today. He's going to make me sign papers that take away my house. My home. The home my husband built with his own hands. The home I've lived in for 58 years. Her voice cracked. She swallowed, pressed on. "He says I'm losing my mind. He found a doctor who agrees. And Monday he goes before a judge." She paused, drew a breath that shuddered on the way in. "I have no children, no family left who cares. No one who will stand beside me and say, 'This woman is not alone.'" She looked at Bear, directly at him, into him, past every patch, every scar, every wall he'd ever built. "You are the most frightening men I have ever seen, and right now that is exactly what I need." Annie's lungs were burning. She hadn't breathed since Dorothy stood up. Bear looked at Dorothy for a long, long time. Then he looked at his brothers. Something passed between them. No words, no nods, no signals. Just a current. A decision made in a language that only exists inside a bond forged by decades on the road together. The kind of language civilians never learn. Bear slid over in the booth. He patted the seat beside him. "What kind of son," he said slowly, "lets his mother stand?" Dorothy's knees buckled. Boone was up in a flash, faster than any man that size should ever be able to move, and caught her elbow. Gently, so gently, like he was handling something irreplaceable. "Easy, Ma," Boone said. "We got you." He guided her into the booth. She sat next to Bear, her tiny frame pressed against his massive one, her white hair against his leather vest, her trembling hands inches from his scarred ones. It should have looked absurd. It looked like the safest place on earth. "Thank you," Dorothy whispered. "Thank you." "Don't thank us yet," Bear said. "We haven't even ordered you anything." He looked up at Annie. "Annie, what does my mother like?" Annie blinked. Her heart hammered. Then she understood. The game was on. "Your mother," Annie said, and her voice held steady despite the earthquake in her chest, "loves blueberry cobbler and chamomile tea, hot, not lukewarm." "Then that's what she gets," Bear said, "and put it on my tab." "You don't have a tab." "I do now." The smallest crack of laughter broke through Dorothy's tears. A tiny sound, a beautiful sound. The sound of a woman who had been drowning, finding a pocket of air. Annie turned toward the kitchen, but she didn't go straight there. She stopped by the biker's table on her way back, leaned down close to Bear's ear, and whispered. She told him everything. The grandnephew, the wife, the papers, the power of attorney, the doctor's evaluation that came from a 12-minute visit, the competency hearing set for Monday, the house worth $1.4 million, the phone Kevin gave Dorothy that only called one number, his, the isolation, the pressure, the threats disguised as concern, every word she'd overheard, every detail she'd been carrying for 6 days like a stone lodged between her ribs. Bear listened without moving, without blinking. His face could have been carved from the same granite as the mountains outside that window. When Annie finished, she straightened up and walked away. Bear sat still for 10 seconds. His jaw was set so tight the muscles in his neck twitched. Then he turned to his brothers. "We're not leaving this booth," he said quietly. "Not until this is done." Earl took off his reading glasses and tucked them into his vest pocket. "How bad?" "Bad enough. Grandnephew's trying to take everything. House, money, independence. Got a bought doctor and a court date Monday." Boone's hands curled into fists beneath the table. The wood creaked. "When's he coming?" "Today, here, to get her signature." Stonewall spoke for the first time all morning. 2 words, low, final, like the sound of a cell door closing. "He won't." Colt leaned forward. "What do you need from us?" Bear looked at Dorothy. She was staring at the table, tears still rolling down her lined cheeks, her hands wrapped around the teacup Annie had set before her, holding it like it was the only warm thing left in the world. "We need to be her family," Bear said. "For real, not pretend, starting right now." He put his arm around her shoulders, carefully, the way you drape a blanket over something fragile. "Dorothy." She looked up. Her eyes were red and wet and terrified, and underneath all of that, blazing was something that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. Hope. Small, bruised, barely surviving, but there. "Tell me about this house of yours." She blinked. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected strategy, plans, anger, not this. Not someone asking her about the things she loved. And so she told him. She told him about Walter, her husband, who built that house with his own hands in 1966. A 2-story white house with a wraparound porch and a view of the Bridger Mountains that still took her breath away every single morning. She told him how Walter planted a row of blue spruce along the north side to break the winter wind, because she was always cold and he couldn't stand the thought of her shivering. She told him about the garden, tomatoes, green beans, sunflowers, 58 years of dirt under her fingernails, and growing things from nothing. She told him how Walter used to bring her the first ripe tomato of the season, like he was presenting a diamond ring, holding it in both hands, grinning like a boy. Walter died in 2007, heart attack, in the garden, holding a tomato. "I found him," Dorothy said softly. "He looked peaceful, like he'd just sat down to rest." Bear didn't say anything. He just listened. His massive, scarred hand rested on her shoulder, steady, unmoving, an anchor. She told him about Patricia, her niece, Kevin's mother. Patricia had been warm, generous, the kind of woman who sent birthday cards to people she'd met once and remembered everyone's children's names. Patricia died in 2019. Cancer, fast and brutal. "After Patricia was gone," Dorothy said, "there was no one left standing between me and Kevin." She looked down at her hands. "He didn't visit for 2 years after his mother died. Not once. No call, no letter, nothing. Then one day he showed up with Megan, smiling, asking about the house, asking about my health, asking about my plans." Her voice hardened. The tremor was still there, but underneath it, Bedrock. I'm 90 years old. I've survived a husband's death, a niece's death, and 57 Montana winters. I am not a fool. I know exactly what they want. Jax, who'd been stirring sugar into his coffee and staring at the table like he was trying to burn a hole through it, looked up. Then why haven't you told someone? Dorothy's face crumbled. The bedrock cracked. And what came through was the rawest, most naked pain Annie had ever seen on a human face. Who would I tell? Her voice broke. My nearest neighbor is a quarter-mile away. I don't drive anymore. I don't own a computer. The phone Kevin gave me... She stopped, swallowed. It only calls him. Silence, the kind that settles over a room when something ugly has just been laid bare under fluorescent light. He made sure of that, Dorothy whispered. Colt's voice came out quiet, controlled, but with an edge that could have drawn blood. The phone only calls him, Dorothy nodded. Colt looked at Bear. Bear looked back. Something dark passed between them, something that didn't need words. That's isolation, Colt said. Classic playbook. You cut communication. You control the information. You make the target completely dependent on one person, one voice, one version of reality. He's not careless, Earl muttered, his voice heavy. This was planned. Months of planning, Annie said from behind the counter. She'd stopped pretending she wasn't listening. At least 3 months, maybe longer. Dorothy stared at all of them. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. You believe me? Bear's arm tightened around her shoulders. Not much, just enough to say, I'm here, I'm not going anywhere. Dorothy, he said, we've spent our whole lives reading people, knowing who's honest and who's full of it, knowing who's dangerous and who's just making noise. He paused. His voice dropped lower. Your grandnephew is dangerous, and you are the most honest person in this room. Dorothy pressed her hand to her mouth. A sound escaped, half sob, half breath. The sound of someone who has been screaming into a void for months and has finally been heard. He's coming today, she said. He told me he'd be here at noon. He said if I don't sign, he goes to the judge Monday and it's out of my hands. Bear checked his watch. 11:47. He looked at his brothers. His voice was calm, steady. The voice of a man who has faced worse than this and is already 3 moves ahead. 13 minutes. Boone cracked his knuckles. The sound was like dry wood splitting. That's plenty, Stonewall said. Bear turned to Dorothy. He took both her hands in his. Her hands disappeared inside his. Tiny white birds swallowed by leather and scar tissue and 30 years of road. Listen to me, he said. When he walks through that door, you don't say a word. Not one. You sit right here next to me and you let us handle it. Can you do that? Dorothy nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again. I'm scared, she admitted. Good, Bear said. That means you're paying attention. But Dorothy, look at me. She looked at him. Those 90-year-old eyes, sharp and wet and full of everything she'd survived, locked onto his. You walked up to 6 Hell's Angels and asked us to be your family. A woman who does that isn't weak. A woman who does that is the bravest person I've met in 30 years on the road. Dorothy's lip trembled, but she didn't look away. Now eat your cobbler, Bear said. Your son is telling you to eat. She laughed, a real laugh, small and cracked and beautiful and alive. She picked up her fork, and then, because timing in life is either perfect or cruel, and today it was both, the bell above the door jingled. Annie looked up. Her hand tightened on the coffee pot. Kevin Hale walked in, brown leather portfolio under his arm. Megan beside him, sunglasses perched on her head, phone in hand like a weapon. They were smiling. They were confident. They walked in the way people walk when they believe they've already won. They expected to find Dorothy alone. They expected to find a frightened old woman sitting by herself in a window booth, ready to sign away her life. Instead, they found her sitting in the arms of 6 Hell's Angels, with blueberry cobbler on her fork and fire in her eyes. Kevin stopped dead. His smile didn't fall, it shattered, like glass hitting concrete. And in the space where that smile had been, Annie saw something she recognized from a lifetime ago, from a different man in a different place. The face of a predator who has just realized his prey is no longer alone. Kevin's smile didn't come back. He stood 3 steps inside the door, portfolio pressed against his chest, and his eyes moved across that booth like a man counting threats. Leather, patches, tattoos, 6 men built like they'd been pulled from the earth itself. And Dorothy, tiny, silver-haired Dorothy, sitting in the middle of them with a fork in her hand and a look on her face he had never seen before. She wasn't trembling. Megan nearly walked into his back. She caught herself, looked past his shoulder, and her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Annie set the coffee pot down on the counter. Her hand was shaking, but her feet were planted. Walt and Jean had stopped eating entirely. The young couple in the far booth put their phones down. Marco leaned out from the kitchen window and didn't pull back. Every pair of eyes in that diner locked onto the same spot. Kevin found his voice first. He always did. That was his skill, filling silence before anyone else could, controlling the air in the room the way a thermostat controls temperature. Aunt Dorothy, tight, measured. "I see you've got company." Dorothy opened her mouth, caught Bear's eye, closed it. Bear spoke instead. He didn't stand. He didn't lean forward. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Kevin the way a man looks at something that has crawled into a space where it doesn't belong. "She does." 2 words, flat, final, like a door closing and locking at the same time. Kevin blinked. His fingers shifted on the portfolio. Annie could see his knuckles whitening through the leather. "And you are?" Bear smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a threatening smile. Something in between, something worse. The kind of smile that says, "I already know how this ends. You don't." "I'm her son." The temperature in the room dropped. Annie felt it on her skin. Everyone felt it. Megan took a half step backward without realizing she'd done it. "That's not possible," Megan said, her voice pitched higher than she wanted it to. "She doesn't have children." Boone's deep rumble came from across the table. "Funny, because she's got 6. Kevin's jaw tightened. He was recalculating. Annie could see it happening behind his eyes, the rapid adjustment of a man who walked into a room expecting one chessboard and found a completely different game. But Kevin Hale hadn't spent months planning this to be thrown off by a booth full of leather vests. He was too smart for that, too invested. He straightened his shoulders, smoothed his expression, put the mask back on. "I don't know what's happening here," he said, "but I have a scheduled meeting with my aunt to discuss her care arrangements. This is a private family matter." "Sit down," Bear said. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the kind of sentence that lands in a room and dares you to ignore it. Kevin didn't sit. He shifted his weight forward instead, toward Dorothy. "Aunt Dorothy, I need to speak with you. In private." Dorothy looked at Bear. Bear shook his head. Once. Small. Dorothy looked back at Kevin, and for the first time, for the very first time in months of pressure, months of manipulation, months of smiling threats dressed up as concern, Dorothy Hale said the word she'd been swallowing like poison. "No." 1 syllable, quiet, but it landed like a grenade. Kevin's composure cracked. Just a fraction. Just enough for Annie and everyone else in that room to glimpse what was underneath the sport coat and the perfect teeth and the rehearsed handshake. Something cold. Something hungry. "Dorothy, you don't understand what you're—" She said no. Stonewall. He hadn't moved, hadn't shifted in his seat, hadn't raised his voice above the level of normal conversation. But those 3 words hit the room like a sledgehammer striking a bell. They rang. They echoed. They filled every corner. Kevin looked at Stonewall. Stonewall looked back. Whatever Kevin saw in those eyes, whatever lived behind that silence, made him take a half step backward. His heel scraped the floor. He probably didn't even realize he'd retreated. Megan grabbed Kevin's arm. Her nails dug into his sleeve. "Let's just go. We'll deal with this Monday." But Kevin wasn't ready. Annie could see it. He was doing the math. Months of preparation, a bought doctor, a filed assessment, a court date 72 hours away. He wasn't going to abandon all of that because of some bikers in a roadside diner. He took a breath, long, controlled. He smoothed his face back into its practiced calm. And then he did something that made Annie's stomach turn. He softened his voice. Weaponized gentleness. Turned concern into a blade. "Dorothy," he said, and his tone was warm now, almost tender. "These people don't know you. They don't know your situation. They don't know your medical history or your needs." He gestured at the booth. "I'm your family. I'm the one who's been visiting you, looking after you, making sure you're safe." He paused. Let that sink in. "Is this really who you want deciding your future? Men you've never met? Men who—" He glanced at the patches, the tattoos. "Look at them, Dorothy. Really look." It was surgical, designed to isolate, to remind her that Kevin was the familiar face, the known quantity, the family, and these men were strangers. Dangerous strangers. The kind of strangers a confused old woman might latch onto because she couldn't think straight anymore. Annie's hands balled into fists at her sides. She recognized the move. She'd lived through the move, the concerned voice, the gentle words, the invisible knife sliding between ribs while the hand on your shoulder whispered that everything was going to be fine. Bear felt Dorothy tense beside him. Her whole body went rigid. The fork in her hand trembled. For one terrible second, Annie thought it was working, thought the months of conditioning were pulling Dorothy back into Kevin's orbit like gravity. Bear squeezed her hand. Once. Steady. Not hard. Just enough to say, "I'm still here." And Dorothy Hale, 90 years old, barely 110 pounds, sitting in a diner booth with a half-eaten cobbler and 6 men she'd known for less than an hour, lifted her chin. "Kevin," her voice shook, but it didn't break. "You gave me a phone that only calls you." Kevin's smile flickered. "You brought a doctor I've never met to my house. A man who spent 12 minutes with me and decided I can't think straight." The flicker became a crack. "You want me to sign away my home, the home your great-uncle Walter built with his bare hands, the home where I've lived for 58 years. So you can sell it for $1.4 million and put me in a facility I don't need." The crack became a fissure. Kevin's mask was failing. Megan's hand on his arm tightened until her knuckles went white. Dorothy's voice got stronger, each word harder than the last. "These men have known me for 45 minutes, and in those 45 minutes they have shown me more kindness than you have in 2 years." The diner was so silent Annie could hear the ice melting in someone's water glass across the room. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Dorothy looked at Kevin, not at his face, through it, past the smile, past the charm, past every mask he'd ever worn. "I'm not signing anything. Not today, not Monday, not ever." The mask came off, just for a second. Just one naked, unguarded second. And in that second, every person in Rosie's Trailside Diner saw what Dorothy Hale had been living with for months. The cold, calculating fury of a man who has been denied something he believes he owns. Not anger, something worse. The quiet rage of entitlement. The look of a man who sees a 90-year-old woman not as a person, but as an obstacle standing between him and a payday. "You're making a mistake," Kevin said, low, stripped of all pretense. Almost a whisper, almost a threat, fully both. Bear stood up. He didn't rush, didn't lunge, didn't make a sound. He just rose. The way a mountain rises when the land shifts beneath it. Slow, inevitable, permanent. He was a head taller than Kevin, twice as wide. But it wasn't the size that made Kevin take another step back. It was the stillness, the absolute terrifying calm of a man who has nothing to prove and everything to protect. "I think you heard her," Bear said. He extended his hand, palm up, open. "Give me the folder." Every sound in the diner stopped. The ceiling fan above them seemed to freeze mid-rotation. The air itself went solid. Kevin clutched the portfolio against his chest, reflexive, like a child guarding a toy. "These are legal documents. You can't just—" "I didn't ask what they are." Bear's hand didn't move. His eyes didn't blink. "I said, give them to me." 10 seconds passed. Annie counted every one. Each second felt like a minute. Each minute felt like an hour. Kevin looked around the diner, searching for an ally, searching for someone, anyone, who would take his side. He found Walt, who stared back with the flat, unimpressed eyes of a man who'd been ranching for 50 years and could smell a predator at 100 yards. He found Gene, whose fork was frozen halfway to his mouth, face hard as granite. He found the young couple, who looked at Kevin like he was something stuck to the bottom of their shoe. He found Marco, arms crossed in the kitchen window, shaking his head slowly. He found Annie, standing behind the counter, tears on her face and steel in her eyes. And he found Dorothy, who wasn't trembling anymore, who sat in that booth surrounded by 6 men who had chosen to be her shield. Looking at her grandnephew was something Kevin had never seen from her before. Pity. Not fear, not submission. Pity. The look of a woman who has finally seen someone clearly and feels sorry for what they've become. Kevin handed over the portfolio. His hands shook when he did it. Annie saw it. Everyone saw it. Bear took it. He didn't open it, didn't flip through the pages, didn't read a single word. He gripped the leather folder with both hands and tore it in half. The sound was sharp, clean, sudden, like a branch snapping in winter. Then he tore it again, and again. Paper rained down on the table, fragments of notarized signatures, legal language, carefully constructed lies, all of it falling like confetti at a funeral. Megan gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. Kevin's face went chalk white. Bear brushed the shreds from his hands. Casual. The way you'd brush crumbs from a table after finishing a meal. "There," he said. "That's simpler." Dorothy covered her mouth with both hands. Her shoulders were shaking. But she wasn't crying from fear. Not anymore. "Those were notarized documents," Kevin said. His voice was thin, hollow, stripped of every layer of polish he'd spent years building. "I will call the police. I will have every single one of you arrested for destruction of—" "For what?" Colt said. He leaned back in the booth, arms crossed, the faintest ghost of a smile on his face. "Destroying papers an elderly woman never agreed to sign? Papers she was being coerced into signing?" He tilted his head. "Go ahead, call them. We'll wait." He gestured at the table. "We've got coffee." Kevin's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. He looked like a fish pulled onto dry land, gasping, suffocating on air that was supposed to be his element. Bear leaned forward, not far, just a few inches. But those few inches closed the distance between two worlds. The world Kevin thought he controlled, and the world where men like Bear had been settling accounts since before Kevin learned to knot a tie. "Here's what's going to happen," Bear said. His voice was low, steady, the voice of a man who knows exactly how much power he holds and has no need to demonstrate it because every person in the room can already feel it. "You're going to cancel your Monday hearing." Kevin didn't move. "Dorothy is going to see a real doctor, one she picks, not you." Megan pulled Kevin's arm. He didn't budge. He was frozen, locked in Bear's gaze like a rabbit caught in headlights that knows the truck isn't stopping. "And if we hear that you've contacted her, visited her house, sent anyone to her door, or so much as thought about her name without her permission, Bear paused. Let the silence do the work. You'll see us again, and next time we won't be sitting in a diner eating cobbler. The room held its breath for so long that Annie's vision started to blur. Megan yanked Kevin's arm, hard, desperate. We are leaving, now. Kevin stumbled backward. His mouth worked silently. He looked at Dorothy one final time, and what Annie saw in his eyes wasn't anger. It was fear. Not the fear of 6 bikers, the fear of exposure. The fear of every person in this diner who had just witnessed his mask come off. The fear of a story that would be told and retold and would follow him for the rest of his life. The fear of walls closing in on a scheme that was supposed to be airtight and had just been ripped apart by a man who tore legal documents the way most people tear napkins. The bell jingled as Kevin and Megan shoved through the door. Their footsteps were fast on the gravel. A car door slammed, an engine started, tires spun, and they were gone. Silence held the room for 3 full seconds. Then Dorothy broke. She turned into Bear's chest and sobbed. Not quiet crying, not dignified tears. Deep, racking, bone-shaking sobs that came from a place so far down inside her that they had probably been building since the first time Kevin sat across from her in that booth and slid a folder across the table. Months of fear, months of isolation, months of lying awake in a house built by a dead man's hands, wondering if she'd lose it before she died in it. All of it came pouring out of her like a dam giving way. Bear wrapped both arms around her. He held her the way you hold someone who has been drowning and has just broken the surface. Tight enough that she could feel him, gentle enough that she could breathe. Boone placed his hand on her back, broad, warm, steady. Earl took off his glasses, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, put the glasses in his vest pocket, and didn't put them back on. Jack stared at the table. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles jumped. He blinked fast. Again. Again. Colt looked out the window at the empty parking lot where Kevin's car had been and said nothing. Stonewall bowed his head. His lips moved, but no sound came out. And from somewhere near the counter, a single pair of hands started clapping. Walt. Slow. Deliberate. The calloused clap of a rancher who'd never been a man of words, but knew when something needed to be acknowledged. Then Jean. Then the young couple. Then Marco, leaning out the kitchen window, clapping with flour-dusted hands and tears in his eyes he'd deny later. Then Annie, standing behind the counter, coffee pot forgotten, tears streaming without shame, clapping with everything she had. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a standing ovation. It wasn't applause for a performance. It was something deeper. Something that doesn't have a name in any language Annie knew. The sound of a room full of people recognizing they had just witnessed something they would carry in their chests for the rest of their lives. Something raw and messy and imperfect and completely, entirely real. Dorothy lifted her head from Bear's chest. Her eyes were red. Her silver hair was coming undone from its careful bun. She looked around at these men, these strangers who had become her wall in less than an hour. I asked for one son, she whispered. Bear looked at her. His eyes were wet. He didn't hide it, didn't wipe them, didn't look away. You got 6, he said. And Ma, we don't do refunds. Dorothy laughed through her tears, a broken, beautiful, impossible laugh. The laugh of a woman who has just discovered that the world is both crueler and kinder than she ever imagined. And she doesn't know what to do with that except laugh and cry at the same time. Bear picked up a napkin and handed it to her. She took it, dabbed her eyes, took a breath, then another. He'll come back, she said quietly. Kevin doesn't quit. He never quits. He'll find another way. Bear nodded. I know. Monday, the judge. He still has the doctor's report on file. He still has the court date. I know that too. Dorothy looked at him, searching his face for the same thing she'd been searching Kevin's face for months, the truth. The difference was, when she searched Bear's face, she found it. "What do we do?" she asked. Bear looked at his brothers, then he looked at Annie, then he looked back at Dorothy. "First thing, that phone he gave you, the one that only calls him, where is it?" "In my purse." "Give it to me." Dorothy opened her purse and pulled out a cheap flip phone. Nothing fancy, no apps, no internet, just a phone that rang when Kevin wanted it to ring and called when Kevin allowed it to call. A leash disguised as a gift. Bear took it, turned it over in his hand. Then he set it on the table, picked up his coffee mug, and brought it down on the phone with one sharp motion. The screen cracked, the plastic casing split, pieces scattered across the tabletop. Dorothy flinched at the sound. Then she stared at the shattered phone. Then she looked at Bear, and she smiled. A real smile. A fierce 90-year-old, "I survived everything and I'm still here" smile that lit up her face like sunlight breaking through a storm. "I've wanted to do that for 3 months, she said. "Should have called us sooner, Ma," Jack said. And for the first time, somebody actually laughed at one of his jokes. Bear reached into his vest and pulled out a prepaid phone. Basic, reliable. He pressed a few buttons, then handed it to Dorothy. "One number, mine. You press that button anytime, day or night, and I answer. That's how it works now." Dorothy took the phone. Her hands were still shaking, but they were shaking less. Colt leaned forward across the table. "Dorothy, I need you to think carefully. The doctor Kevin brought, the one who did the evaluation, do you remember his name?" "Kemp," Dorothy said immediately. "Dr. Leonard Kemp. He came to my house. He was there for 12 minutes. I know because I watched the clock the entire time. He asked me what day it was, who the president was, and whether I could count backward from 100 by sevens. Then he wrote something on a clipboard and left." Colt's expression hardened. 12 minutes. 12 minutes. He didn't ask about my medical history. He didn't ask about my medications. He didn't talk to my real doctor. He never looked me in the eye. Not once. Earl shook his head slowly. 12 minutes to declare a woman incompetent. That's not medicine. That's a hit job. "It is a hit job," Colt said, "and it's the kind of thing that falls apart the second a real doctor actually examines her." He looked at Bear. "She needs an independent evaluation. From someone credible. Someone a judge will listen to." Bear nodded. "I know someone who knows someone." "She also needs a lawyer," Annie said from behind the counter. She'd been quiet, but her mind had been running full speed since Kevin walked out that door. "Kevin's got legal representation. He's got a filed petition. Dorothy needs someone who can walk into that courtroom Monday and tear this apart." Bear looked at her. Then he looked at Dorothy. "One thing at a time," he said. "Right now we get Dorothy home safe. Colt, you're on her house tonight. Nobody gets within 100 yards of that porch without us knowing." Colt nodded. No hesitation, like he'd already planned for it. "Boone, you drive her home. Take the long way. Make sure nobody follows." Boone was already standing. "I'll need her address." 1847 Willow Creek Road, Dorothy said. "The white house with the blue spruce trees." Boone smiled down at her, a gentle smile that shouldn't have been possible on a face that hard. "The one your husband built." Dorothy's eyes filled again. "Yes, the one my husband built." Bear stood. He helped Dorothy to her feet. She was small beside him, fragile. But when she straightened her back and lifted her chin, something shifted in the room. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side holding a weapon she didn't have an hour ago. She had people. She had sons, 6 of them, and they weren't going anywhere. Bear placed his hands on her shoulders. "Dorothy, I need you to hear me." She looked up at him. "Whatever happens next, and things are going to happen because men like Kevin don't walk away clean, you are not alone anymore. You understand? That is over. That part of your life is finished. Dorothy pressed her lips together. Her chin quivered once. She steadied it. I understand, she said. Good. Now go home with Boone. Lock your doors. Don't answer the phone unless it's me. And tomorrow morning, I'm going to be on your porch with coffee and a plan. Dorothy reached up and placed her hand on Bear's cheek, her small, wrinkled hand against his weathered face. An old woman touching the face of a stranger who had become her son in the space of an hour. Walter would have liked you, she whispered. Bear's jaw tightened. His eyes glistened. He didn't speak for a moment. Couldn't. I would have liked Walter, he said finally. Dorothy picked up her purse. She turned toward the door. Boone offered his arm. She took it. They walked out of Rosie's Trailside Diner together, a 6'5" biker and a 90-year-old woman, and every single person in that room watched them go. Annie waited until the door closed. Then she braced both hands on the counter and let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 3 weeks. Bear sat back down in the booth. The cobbler plate was still there. The shattered phone was still on the table. The torn paper was still scattered across the surface like confetti nobody wanted. He looked at Annie. You started this, he said. Not accusation, recognition. You told me what was happening. You carried this for 6 days and didn't look away. Annie's throat tightened. I'm a waitress, Bear. I pour coffee. I don't... You heard a woman drowning and you threw her a rope. Don't tell me what you don't do. Annie pressed her lips together. She didn't trust herself to speak. Bear leaned back. He looked at his brothers. The table was quiet. The diner was empty now. Walt and Jean had left. The young couple had gone. Marco had retreated to the kitchen. It was just the 5 of them and Annie. Kevin Hale is not going to let this go, Bear said. He's got too much invested, too much money on the table. He'll regroup. He'll find another angle. And when he does, it'll be worse. Earl nodded. He'll come at her sideways. He won't make the same mistake twice. Then we don't give him the chance, Colt said. His eyes were sharp, calculating. The same look Annie had seen on Kevin's face, but pointed in the opposite direction. We need to move faster than he does. Doctor first, lawyer second. And we need a paper trail. Everything Annie overheard, everything Dorothy can testify to, dates and times and direct quotes. All of it documented. All of it locked down where Kevin can't touch it. Bear looked at Annie. You willing to put what you heard in writing? Annie's stomach dropped. She thought about Kevin sitting at her counter. Kevin finding out who talked. Kevin with his lawyers and his money and his cold, surgical fury. She thought about Dorothy crying in that booth. Alone. The phone that only called one number. Yes, Annie said. I'll put it in writing. Bear held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. Then we start tonight. He stood up, dropped 3 20s on the table, looked around the empty diner one last time. Annie. Yeah? Lock up early and don't go home alone. He walked out. The bell jingled behind him. His boots hit the gravel. The Harley roared to life, that deep, chest-shaking thunder that Annie had heard every Thursday for 8 years. But today it sounded different. Today it didn't sound like noise. It sounded like a promise. Annie stood behind the counter in the empty diner, surrounded by silence in the faint smell of blueberry cobbler, and she knew, with a certainty she felt in her bones, that what started today in this room wasn't going to end quietly. Kevin Hale was out there right now, in his car, with his wife, with his rage recalculating, planning his next move, finding the weak points. And the first weak point he'd find was her. Annie was right. It took Kevin Hale exactly 41 hours to strike back. Saturday morning, the phone rang in Dorothy's kitchen, the old landline, the one Kevin didn't know she still had, the one that hung on the wall next to Walter's handwritten list of emergency numbers from 1987. Dorothy picked it up on the 3rd ring, and the line went dead. No voice, no breathing, Just the click of someone who wanted her to know they were there. She set the phone down. Her hand was steady. That surprised her. 11 minutes later, it rang again. This time, a voice. "Dorothy, sweetheart, it's Megan." Dorothy's grip tightened on the receiver. Megan's voice poured through the line like honey, warm, sweet, and absolutely poisonous. The same voice that had said 1.4 million, like she was reading a stock ticker. "I just want you to know that we're worried about you. Kevin barely slept last night. He feels terrible about how things went at the diner. Those men, they put you in a very confusing situation, and we understand that. We don't blame you." Dorothy listened. She didn't speak. "We'd love to come by this afternoon, just family, no strangers, no pressure. We just want to sit with you and make sure you're okay. That's all we've ever wanted, Dorothy." Dorothy closed her eyes. 6 months ago, she might have believed it. 3 months ago, she might have hesitated. 3 weeks ago, she might have said yes, just to make the pressure stop. But that was before Thursday, before she walked across a diner floor on legs that could barely hold her and asked 6 strangers to be what her own blood refused to be. "No," Dorothy said. Silence on the other end. Then Megan, recalibrating. "Dorothy, honey, I don't think you understand. I said no, Megan." She hung up. Her hand was shaking when she set the phone down, but her spine felt different. Straighter, harder, like someone had slipped a steel rod into it overnight. She reached for the prepaid phone Bear had given her. One button, one number. She pressed it. Bear answered on the second ring. "Ma." That word, one syllable. She'd heard it from him 4 times now, and each time it cracked open something inside her she'd thought sealed shut the day Walter died. Something she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten it was there. The feeling of being someone's person, of mattering enough that a phone gets answered before the 3rd ring. "They called," Dorothy said. "Megan wants to come over today." "Did you say yes?" "I said no." "Good, don't answer that phone again. I'm sending Colt." Colt arrived in 18 minutes. He parked his Harley in the driveway, walked up to the porch, sat down in Walter's old rocking chair like he'd been doing it his whole life, and pulled a paperback from his vest pocket. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He just sat there, reading, a thermos of coffee beside him, looking for all the world like a man enjoying a quiet Saturday morning. Except his eyes moved across every car that passed on the road. Every one. At 2:14 p.m., a silver sedan appeared at the far end of Willow Creek Road. It slowed as it approached the white house with the blue spruce trees. Through the windshield, 2 figures. Kevin driving, Megan in the passenger seat. They got close enough to see the Harley in the driveway. Close enough to see Colt, sitting perfectly still in the rocking chair, book in one hand, his steady, unblinking gaze locked on their car with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do except exactly this. The sedan didn't stop. It didn't slow further. It accelerated past the house and disappeared around the bend. Colt took a sip of his coffee, turned a page. Dorothy watched from the kitchen window. Her heart was pounding, but she was smiling. Sunday passed without incident. Colt stayed until dark, then Boone took over. Boone sat on the same porch in a different chair, one of Walter's old lawn chairs that groaned under his weight, and read nothing. He just sat, watching the road, watching the dark. His presence alone was a perimeter. Monday morning came, what was supposed to be Kevin's court date. The day he'd planned to stand before a judge and argue that his 90-year-old aunt couldn't manage her own affairs. The day he'd planned to take everything. Instead, Bear had been working the phones since Friday. Not the kind of calls most people make. Bear knew people. Not lawyers, not politicians, not anyone who'd show up in a directory or answer to a title, but people who knew people who knew people. The kind of network that exists in the spaces between official channels, built on decades of favors given and returned, handshakes that meant more than contracts, and a shared understanding that certain things in this world are simply not allowed to happen. By Monday afternoon, Dorothy had an appointment with Dr. Nadine Prescott, a board-certified neurologist in Helena. Prescott had a reputation that preceded her by a mile: thorough, independent, and impossible to buy. She testified in 11 competency cases in the past 5 years, and her evaluations had never once been successfully challenged. The appointment was Wednesday. Earl would drive Dorothy in his truck. Meanwhile, Annie did what Annie had always done. She watched. She listened. She noticed. And what she noticed Monday afternoon turned her blood to ice. Kevin walked into Rosie's alone. No Megan, no portfolio, no sport coat. He wore jeans and a plain button-down, like a man trying to look ordinary, trying to look like he wasn't what he was. He sat at the counter. He ordered coffee. He stirred it for 20 minutes without bringing it to his lips. Annie could feel his eyes on her every time she turned her back. The weight of his gaze was physical, a pressure between her shoulder blades that made her skin crawl. She refilled salt shakers. She wiped the counter. She moved like everything was normal because she'd spent years of her life learning how to look normal when nothing was. Then Kevin spoke, quiet, direct, no warmth, no polish. The voice underneath the voice, the real one. You told them. Annie stopped moving. Her hand froze on the salt shaker. She didn't turn around. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. Kevin's voice was calm, conversational, the kind of calm that's more frightening than shouting, because it means the person has already thought this through and has already decided what they're going to do. You were behind that partition Tuesday. You heard our conversation, and you told those bikers everything. Annie turned around. She looked at him. Her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she was sure he could see it through her shirt. Dorothy asked them for help. I don't control what a 90-year-old woman does in my diner. Kevin smiled, and that smile was the worst thing Annie had seen since he first walked into Rosie's 3 weeks ago. Because it wasn't angry, it wasn't threatening, it was patient. The smile of a man who has done his research and knows he's holding better cards. Annie Dawson, 34, no family in Bozeman, no savings to speak of, renting a one-bedroom apartment on Cottonwood Street, annual income, well, you know what waitresses make. He stirred his coffee. You've built a nice little life here, small but stable. It would be a shame if someone made it expensive. Annie's mouth went dry. I've already spoken with my attorney about a defamation claim. The things you told those men, accusations without evidence, private family matters disclosed to strangers, interference with legal proceedings. My lawyer says it's a strong case. He took a sip of coffee for the first time. Casual, like they were discussing the weather. A lawsuit like that could take years, cost you everything, your apartment, your job, whatever scraps you've managed to hold together. He set the coffee down, looked at her. Or it doesn't have to happen at all. You stay out of Dorothy's business. You stop talking to those bikers, and this goes away. Your choice. He stood up, placed a $5 bill on the counter, walked to the door. Then he paused, half-turned. You know what I've noticed about people who get involved in things that aren't their business? They always think they're doing the right thing, right up until the moment it costs them everything. The bell jingled. He was gone. Annie stood behind the counter. Her hands were shaking. Her legs felt hollow. She gripped the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles went white. For 30 seconds she couldn't breathe. The walls of the diner pressed in. The floor tilted. Everything Kevin said was true. Not the legal threats, but the rest of it. She had nothing. No savings. No safety net. No family within 1,000 miles. Everything she'd built in 8 years could be dismantled by a man with a lawyer and a grudge. She thought about backing off. For one terrible, honest moment she thought about it. Thought about keeping her head down, pouring coffee, pretending she'd never heard Dorothy's name, going back to the version of herself that survived by not getting involved. The version that had kept her alive before Bozeman, before Rosie's, before all of it. Then she thought about Dorothy's hands wrapped around a teacup, the phone that only called one number, the crying that came through the partition like something breaking that could never be fixed. She picked up her phone and called Bear. He came within the hour. He sat in the corner booth, Dorothy's booth now, their booth, and listened to every word. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react. His face was stone. When Annie finished, Bear was quiet for a long time. Then he leaned forward and looked her in the eyes. Annie, men like Kevin don't go after people who can fight back. They go after people who are alone. Dorothy was alone. That's why he chose her. Now he thinks you're alone too. He paused. Let that land. You're not. Annie's eyes stung. She blinked hard. He's trying to scare you into silence, Bear said. That's how this works. Pressure the witnesses. Isolate the victim. Make everyone too afraid to talk. It's the same playbook he used on Dorothy, and he's running it on you now because he's running out of time and running out of moves. What do I do? Annie's voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. She hated that, hated the smallness, hated that Kevin could shrink her with words in a way that nothing else in 8 years had managed. Bear told her, step by step, clear and steady. First, you file a report with Adult Protective Services. Anonymous. Everything you overheard. Dates, times, direct quotes. The 12-minute evaluation. The power of attorney. The isolation. The phone. All of it. You put it on record. Will they actually do anything? They have to investigate, by law. Once it's in the system, it's in the system. Kevin can't make it disappear. Annie nodded. Her hands were still shaking, but something in her chest had shifted. The same something that had shifted Thursday when she'd leaned down and whispered in Bear's ear. Second, Bear said, you don't change a thing about your routine. You come to work. You pour coffee. You don't hide. Men like Kevin feed on fear. You starve him. And if he files the lawsuit? Bear almost smiled. Almost. He won't. A defamation suit means discovery. Discovery means everything he's done to Dorothy gets pulled into the light. His doctor, his forged evaluations, his isolation tactics. He files that suit, he hands us every weapon we need. Annie stared at him. You've thought about this. I've been thinking about it since Thursday. That night, Annie sat on the floor of her apartment. It was 11 p.m. Her phone was in her hand. The number for the Montana Adult Protective Services hotline glowed on the screen. She stared at it for a long time. She thought about every story she'd read at 2 a.m. The old people who lost everything because nobody made the call. The families who looked the other way. The neighbors who thought it wasn't their business. The waitresses who poured coffee and kept their mouths shut. She pressed the button. The call lasted 47 minutes. She gave them everything. Dates, times, names. Kevin Hale, Megan Hale, Dr. Leonard Kemp, Dorothy Hale, the diner, the overheard conversations, the phone that only called one number, the 12-minute evaluation, the $1.4 million, the competency hearing. Every single detail she'd carried in her chest for weeks, she laid out on the phone like evidence on a table. When she hung up, she was crying. Not from fear, from relief. The kind of relief that comes from finally doing the thing you knew you had to do, but were terrified to start. She texted Bear 2 words. It's done. He replied in 3. Proud of you. Annie set her phone on the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest. She sat in her quiet apartment in Bozeman, Montana, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 8 years. She felt like she wasn't running anymore. Wednesday came. Earl pulled his truck up to Dorothy's house at 7 a.m. sharp. Dorothy was already on the porch, dressed in her best blue cardigan, white hair pinned perfectly, clutching her purse with both hands. Colt stood beside her, arms crossed, watching the road. You look like you're going to church, Earl said. I feel like I'm going to war, Dorothy replied. Earl smiled, opened the passenger door. Same thing, sometimes. The drive to Helena took 2 hours. Earl didn't play the radio. Dorothy didn't ask him to. They rode in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. The silence of two people who understood that some moments don't need to be filled with noise. Dr. Nadine Prescott's office was in a medical building off Last Chance Gulch. Prescott herself was 57, gray-streaked hair pulled back in a braid, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She shook Dorothy's hand and held it for an extra second, not out of pity, but recognition. The recognition of one sharp woman meeting another. Mrs. Hale, I've reviewed the referral notes. I'd like to spend some real time with you today, if that's all right. How much time? Dorothy asked. As much as we need. Dorothy sat down. Then let's begin. 2 hours. Dr. Prescott spent 2 full hours with Dorothy Hale. Not 12 minutes, not standing in a living room with a clipboard. 2 hours of comprehensive neurological testing, cognitive evaluation, real conversation, real observation. Memory tests, reasoning exercises, problem-solving tasks, long discussions about Dorothy's daily routine, her medical history, her medications, her social situation, her emotional state. Dorothy answered every question. She didn't stumble. She didn't hesitate. She recited Walter's birthday, their wedding date, the exact year every blue spruce was planted, the names of every teacher she'd had in elementary school, the price of tomatoes at the Bozeman Farmers Market, and the current sitting governor of Montana. When the evaluation was complete, Dr. Prescott removed her glasses and looked at Dorothy for a long, quiet moment. Mrs. Hale, I want to be very clear with you. My conclusion is definitive. You are not cognitively impaired. Your memory is normal for your age. Better than normal, frankly. Your reasoning is intact. Your judgment is sound. There is no clinical basis whatsoever for a competency proceeding. Dorothy pressed her hand to her chest. Her eyes filled. Her lips moved before any sound came out. Thank you, Walter, she whispered. Dr. Prescott wasn't finished. She leaned forward. Her expression shifted from clinical to something harder, something angry. I want to tell you something else. I've reviewed the evaluation conducted by Dr. Leonard Kemp, the one your nephew submitted to the court. Dorothy's body went still. A 12-minute visit, no comprehensive cognitive testing, no medical history review, no collateral information from your primary care physician, no assessment of your daily functioning, no standardized instruments of any kind. Prescott paused. Mrs. Hale, that evaluation doesn't meet any recognized standard of care. It's not just insufficient, it's negligent. And I intend to say exactly that in my report. Dorothy stared at her. Will a judge listen? A judge will have no choice. My report will include a formal flag recommending investigation of Dr. Kemp's practices. What he did to you, if he's done it to others. She stopped herself. Professional restraint. But Dorothy saw the fire behind it. Thank you, Dorothy said, steady, clear. You have no idea what this means. I think I do, Prescott said quietly. I see cases like yours more often than anyone should. Earl was waiting in the truck. When Dorothy climbed in, he looked at her face and knew before she said a word. Clean bill of health, Dorothy said. She said my mind is sharper than most people half my age. Earl put the truck in gear. Didn't need a doctor to tell us that. Dorothy laughed. A real laugh, full and warm. And then she said something that made Earl grip the steering wheel tighter. She's going to investigate Dr. Kemp. Earl glanced at her. The doctor Kevin brought? Dr. Prescott said his evaluation was negligent. She's flagging it in her report. She thinks he may have done this to other people. Earl was quiet for a long moment. The highway hummed beneath the tires. Other people, he repeated. That's what she said. Earl drove in silence for another mile. Then, If that doctor's been doing this to other people, Dorothy, then this thing is bigger than Kevin, bigger than your house, bigger than all of us. Dorothy looked out the window at the mountains. The Bridger Range, snow-capped, ancient, immovable. Like something that had decided a long time ago where it stood and never once considered moving. Good, she said. Thursday, Bear called a meeting. Not at the diner, at Dorothy's kitchen table. The same table where Walter had eaten breakfast every morning for 41 years. The same table where Kevin had spread his papers and made his threats. Now it held 6 coffee cups, a plate of cookies Dorothy had baked that morning, and Carmen Reyes's briefcase. Carmen was Colt's card to play. His ex-wife's sister, an elder law attorney in Missoula with 17 years of experience and a reputation for being the kind of lawyer who walked into courtrooms like she owned them. She and Colt hadn't spoken since the divorce, 4 years of silence. But Colt had swallowed his pride and made the call, because pride is a luxury you don't get when a 90-year-old woman is counting on you. Carmen had listened to everything on the phone. She'd asked 3 questions, each one sharper than the last. Then she'd said, "If a doctor is fabricating competency reports, I will take this case pro bono, and I will enjoy every second of tearing him apart." She drove up from Missoula Monday, 49 years old, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, with a briefcase that had seen as many battles as Bear's leather vest. She sat at Dorothy's kitchen table for 3 hours, documenting everything. The phone that only called Kevin, the 12-minute evaluation, the isolation, the pressure campaigns, the threats disguised as concern. Megan's exact words at the diner. Kevin's exact words at the diner. Annie's overheard conversations. Dates, times, names, amounts. She photographed every document Dorothy had. Every letter Kevin had sent. Every piece of paper Kemp had left behind. She put originals in Walter's gun safe and took copies in her briefcase. Then she looked at Dorothy across the kitchen table and told her the truth. Kevin filed a new petition. The room went cold. Not with the local court, with the district court in Billings. Different jurisdiction, different judge, one who's never heard your name, never seen your face, doesn't know anything about Thursday at the diner. Bear's jaw clenched. When? Friday hearing, 7 days from now, and Kemp filed an amended evaluation, expanded, more detailed. He claims he conducted a follow-up assessment last week. Colt leaned forward. He wasn't anywhere near Dorothy last week. I know that, Carmen said. You know that. Dorothy knows that, but the filing says otherwise. Which means Dr. Kemp didn't just make a bad evaluation. He fabricated a second one. He committed fraud. The kitchen was silent. Dorothy's hands were flat on the table, steady. Her face was pale but composed. The face of a woman who had been hit before and knew how to stay standing. What do we do? Dorothy asked. Carmen opened her briefcase, pulled out a yellow legal pad covered in handwriting so precise it looked typed. We hit them from 3 sides. First, I file a motion to dismiss based on Dr. Prescott's evaluation. Her credentials are impeccable. Her report will make Kemp's assessment look like it was written on the back of a napkin. Second, I file a formal complaint against Kemp with the Montana Board of Medical Examiners. A fabricated evaluation is a criminal offense, not just malpractice. Third, I request that the court appoint an independent evaluator of their choosing. Any real doctor who spends real time with Dorothy will see exactly what Dr. Prescott saw. She looked at Dorothy. The only way Kevin wins is if nobody actually looks at you. Our job is to make sure everyone looks. Bear nodded slowly. And Kevin's lawyers? Kevin's lawyer is a real estate attorney named Paul Whitfield, who's been handling property transactions, not elder law. He's out of his depth and he doesn't know it yet. By the time I'm done with my motion, he'll know. Dorothy studied Carmen with the same evaluating gaze she'd used on Bear that first day in the diner. The gaze of a woman who had spent 90 years learning to read people. Tell me what you need from me, Dorothy said, and I'll do it. Carmen met her eyes. I need you to do exactly what you've been doing. Be sharp, be clear, be yourself. And on Friday, I need you to sit in that courtroom and let that judge see the woman I'm seeing right now. Dorothy straightened her shoulders. I've been doing that for 90 years. I'm not about to stop. That night, after everyone had left, after the coffee cups were washed and the cookies were put away and the house was quiet, Bear sat alone on Dorothy's porch. The night was cold. The stars were thick. The blue spruce trees whispered in the wind the way they'd been whispering since Walter planted them 60 years ago. Bear pulled out his personal phone, scrolled through his contacts to a name he hadn't opened in years. A photograph, faded, small on the screen. A woman with dark hair and a tired smile, standing in front of a house that didn't belong to her anymore. His mother, Margaret Ann Garrison, died in a state care facility in Billings in 2011. Room 114, a room with a number instead of a name. She'd signed her house away to a man who told her he loved her. Bear was on the road when it happened. He was always on the road. The phone calls he'd ignored, the visits he'd skipped, the signs he'd missed because he was too busy being somewhere else, being someone else, being the man the road made him instead of the son his mother needed. By the time he got there, it was already too late. She was in a bed she didn't recognize, in a room she'd never chosen, wearing a bracelet with a number on it, and she looked at him with eyes that still knew his face, but couldn't remember why it mattered. She died 6 months later, alone. At 3 a.m, the nurse said she was peaceful. Bear never believed that. People who die alone aren't peaceful. They're just quiet. He stared at the photograph for a long time. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. His voice was rough, cracked at the edges. The voice of a man talking to someone who would never answer. "I was too late for you." He put the phone away, looked at Dorothy's house. Fresh white paint that his brothers had put on Saturday. Solid porch boards they'd replaced. Light glowing warm in the kitchen window where Dorothy was washing dishes and humming something old and safe. A song Bear almost recognized, a song his mother used to hum. But I'm not too late for her. He sat on that porch until the last light went off inside. Then he rode home in the dark, and he didn't stop thinking about his mother until the engine noise drowned out everything but the road. Carmen Reyes filed her motion to dismiss at 8:47 a.m. Tuesday morning. 43 pages, every one of them a weapon. She'd built the motion the way a demolition expert builds a charge. Precise, layered, designed to bring the entire structure down in one controlled collapse. Dr. Prescott's comprehensive evaluation front and center. Dorothy's medical records from her primary care physician spanning 12 years. A detailed timeline of Kevin's contact pattern. 2 years of silence after Patricia's death, then sudden reappearance coinciding with the bypass announcement that would spike property values along Willow Creek Road. Phone records showing the prepaid phone Kevin gave Dorothy was locked to a single outgoing number. A sworn affidavit from Annie Dawson documenting every conversation she'd overheard, with dates and direct quotes. And the centerpiece, a formal request for investigation into Dr. Leonard Kemp's amended evaluation, which claimed a follow-up assessment conducted on a date when Colt had been sitting on Dorothy's porch from sunrise to sunset, and could swear under oath that no doctor had come within a mile of that house. Carmen hand-delivered the filing to the district court clerk in Billings. She looked the clerk in the eye and said, "Please make sure Judge Rivera sees this before Friday." The clerk looked at the thickness of the filing, then at Carmen's face. "Is this the Hale competency case?" "It was," Carmen said. "Now it's something else." Wednesday, Kevin's lawyer called Carmen. Paul Whitfield, the real estate attorney who'd wandered into elder law like a man who'd taken a wrong exit and was too proud to turn around. His voice on the phone was clipped, professional, but Carmen heard the tremor underneath it. The tremor of a man who had just read 43 pages and realized he'd been standing on a trapdoor. "Miss Reyes," My client would like to discuss a resolution. Carmen leaned back in her chair. Your client's had months to discuss resolutions. He chose to file a fraudulent competency petition instead. I think we're past discussions. The amended evaluation was fabricated. Your client's doctor claims he conducted a follow-up assessment on October 14th. I have a witness who was physically present at Mrs. Hale's residence for 14 consecutive hours on October 14th and can testify under oath that no medical professional visited the property. That's not a discrepancy, Mr. Whitfield. That's perjury. Silence on the line. The kind of silence that happens when someone realizes the ground beneath them isn't solid anymore. My client maintains. Your client can maintain whatever he likes. I'll see you Friday. She hung up. Then she called Bear. Whitfield's rattled, she said. He called looking for a deal. That means he's read the motion and he knows what's coming. Will he fold? Lawyers like Whitfield fold when the cost of fighting exceeds the cost of walking away. Right now he's doing the math. By Thursday night, he'll know the answer. And Kevin? Carmen paused. Kevin's the variable. Whitfield is a hired gun. He'll walk when the bullets start flying in his direction. But Kevin has skin in this game. $1.4 million worth of skin. Men don't give up that kind of money because a lawyer tells them to. Bear was quiet for a moment. What are you saying? I'm saying Kevin might do something desperate between now and Friday. Keep someone on Dorothy's house. Don't leave her alone. Bear didn't need to be told twice. He called Boone. Boone was on Dorothy's porch within the hour, and he didn't leave until Stonewall relieved him at midnight. Thursday morning, Annie opened the diner at 5 a.m. She'd barely slept. Her mind kept cycling through Kevin's words at the counter. The defamation threat, the lawsuit, the careful inventory of everything she had and how easily it could be taken. She told herself Bear was right. She told herself Kevin wouldn't file. She told herself that discovery would expose him, and he knew it. But at 5 a.m. in an empty diner, alone with your thoughts and the hum of a coffee machine, logic doesn't always win the argument against fear. The bell jingled at 6:15. Annie looked up, expecting the early regulars. It wasn't a regular. Sandra Mitchell walked in, 52 years old, short brown hair, no makeup. A state-issued ID badge clipped to her jacket that read, Montana Department of Public Health and Human Services, Adult Protective Services. Annie's heart stopped. Sandra sat at the counter. She ordered coffee. She took a sip. Then she looked at Annie with eyes that had seen more suffering than most people could imagine and said, I'm the investigator assigned to the report filed on Dorothy Hale. I understand you may have information relevant to my case. Annie set down the coffee pot. Her hands were trembling. I filed that report. I know, Sandra said, and I need to hear everything. From the beginning. Annie told her, all of it. For the second time in a week, she emptied every detail she'd been carrying. But this time, she wasn't talking to a phone line. She was talking to a woman with a badge and the authority to do something about it. Sandra listened without interrupting. She took notes in a small leather notebook with handwriting so small and precise it looked like code. When Annie finished, Sandra closed the notebook and looked at her for a long moment. How long have you known Mrs. Hale? 8 years. She's been coming to this diner since before I got here. And in your observation, does she show any signs of cognitive impairment? Annie almost laughed. Dorothy Hale is the sharpest person I've ever met. She does the crossword puzzle in pen every morning. She remembers every regular's name, their spouse's name, their kids' names. She corrected my math on a check last month, and she was right. Sandra nodded slowly. The report mentions a Dr. Leonard Kemp. He did a 12-minute evaluation. Dorothy told all of us, 12 minutes, no real testing. He came to her house, asked a few questions, wrote something on a clipboard, and left. And now he's filed an amended report claiming he did a follow-up visit that never happened. Sandra's pen stopped moving. She looked up. He claims a visit that didn't occur? We have a witness who was at Dorothy's house the entire day. The doctor never came. Sandra wrote something in her notebook, then she closed it, put it in her jacket pocket, finished her coffee. Ms. Dawson, I want to be transparent with you. What you've described, the isolation, the controlled communication, the financial pressure, the questionable medical evaluation, this isn't a gray area. This is a textbook case of elder financial exploitation. Annie nodded. She knew. She'd read enough at 2 a.m. to know. But I also want to tell you something else. Sandra's voice dropped. Not softer, heavier. Dr. Kemp's name has come up before. Annie went still. What do you mean? I can't discuss open cases, but I can tell you that your report is not the first time his name has crossed my desk. The room tilted. Annie gripped the counter. Not the first time, she repeated. Sandra stood. She left a $5 bill on the counter. I'll be visiting Mrs. Hale this afternoon. I'll also be requesting Dr. Kemp's patient records through a formal subpoena. These things take time, but they do move. She paused at the door. You did the right thing, Miss Dawson. I want you to know that. A lot of people see what you saw and decide it's not their problem. It was always my problem, Annie said quietly. I just didn't know it yet. Sandra left. Annie stood behind the counter, alone in the diner, and the things Sandra had said echoed in her skull like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Not the first time. Kemp had done this before, to other people, other Dorothys, other 90-year-old women and 85-year-old men, and 78-year-old widows, people with houses and savings and lives that someone wanted to take, people who didn't have a diner, didn't have an Annie, didn't have 6 bikers who decided they gave a damn. Annie picked up her phone and called Bear. Her voice was shaking, but not from fear this time, from something harder, something with teeth. Sandra Mitchell from APS was just here. Kemp's name has come up before. He's done this to other people, Bear. Dorothy isn't the only one. Bear was silent for 5 full seconds. When he spoke, his voice was different, quieter, tighter, the voice of a man whose anger had just found a deeper floor. How many? She couldn't say, open cases, but the way she said it, it's not 1 or 2. Another silence. Then Bear said something that Annie would remember for the rest of her life. Then this isn't just about Dorothy anymore. No, Annie said, it's not. Thursday afternoon, Sandra Mitchell visited Dorothy at the house on Willow Creek Road. Boone was on the porch. He stood when Sandra arrived, looked at her badge, and stepped aside without a word. Sandra spent 2 hours with Dorothy. She went through everything, the timeline, the phone, the visits, Kevin's pressure, Megan's involvement, Dr. Kemp's evaluation, the papers Dorothy had been pressured to sign. Dorothy answered every question with the same precision she'd shown Dr. Prescott. Clear, detailed, unflinching. At the end, Sandra sat back and looked at Dorothy with an expression that was half admiration, half heartbreak. Mrs. Hale, you should know that we're going to do everything in our power to make sure this doesn't happen to you. And we're going to look very carefully at Dr. Kemp. Dorothy nodded. Then she said something that surprised Sandra. It's not just me I'm worried about. Sandra tilted her head. What do you mean? If that doctor did this to me, he did it to others. People who didn't have someone to walk across a diner and ask for help. People who signed those papers. People who lost everything. Dorothy's voice hardened, the same bedrock Annie had heard that day in the booth. I want them found. I want them helped. Whatever it takes. Sandra looked at this 90-year-old woman, sitting in the house her husband built, surrounded by photographs of a life well lived, with a biker on her porch and a fire in her eyes, and she understood something she'd carry with her for every case that followed. I'll do my best, Mrs. Hale. Do better than your best, Dorothy said. Those people are running out of time. Friday morning arrived like a held breath. Carmen drove to Billings before dawn. Bear rode with Colt and Earl. 3 Harleys in formation on I-90, cutting through the cold morning air like a blade through silk. Dorothy rode with Boone in Earl's truck because Boone had insisted on driving and Dorothy had insisted on sitting up front where she could see the road ahead. Jax and Stonewall stayed behind. Jax on Dorothy's house, Stonewall at the diner, because Bear didn't want Annie alone today, and Stonewall's presence in a room had a way of making problems reconsider. The courtroom in Billings was smaller than Dorothy expected. Wood-paneled, fluorescent lights. A judge's bench that looked like it had heard 1,000 stories and believed about half of them. Judge Maria Rivera sat behind it, late 50s, dark hair threaded with silver, reading glasses perched on her nose, and the kind of face that gave away absolutely nothing. Kevin was already there, pressed suit, fresh haircut, a new lawyer beside him, not Whitfield. Whitfield had quit the case Tuesday night, 48 hours after reading Carmen's motion. The new attorney was younger, sharper, and clearly expensive. Kevin had escalated. He wasn't going quietly. Megan sat in the gallery, sunglasses off for once. Her face was tight, controlled, but her eyes darted around the courtroom like an animal looking for exits. Dorothy walked in with Bear on one side and Earl on the other. She wore her blue cardigan. Her white hair was pinned perfectly. Her hands were clasped in front of her, and they were not shaking. Kevin saw her, saw Bear, saw Earl. His jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. He was past flinching. He'd committed. He was all in. Carmen took her place at the respondents' table. She opened her briefcase with the calm precision of a surgeon laying out instruments. Dorothy sat beside her. Bear and Earl sat directly behind them in the gallery, close enough that Dorothy could feel them there without turning around. The judge called the case. Kevin's new lawyer, a man named Hargrove, tall, silver-templed, with a voice like polished wood, stood first. Your Honor, we're here today because my client has genuine, documented concerns about his elderly aunt's capacity to manage her own affairs. We have a medical evaluation from Dr. Leonard Kemp supporting this petition, and we ask the court to proceed with a competency hearing. Carmen stood. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke the way a scalpel cuts, with precision so fine you don't feel it until you're already open. Your Honor, I'd like to address the medical evaluation Mr. Hargrove references. Dr. Kemp conducted an initial assessment lasting 12 minutes. 12 minutes, Your Honor. No standardized cognitive testing. No medical history review. No collateral information from Mrs. Hale's primary care physician. No functional assessment of any kind. She placed Dr. Prescott's report on the bench. In contrast, Dr. Nadine Prescott, board-certified neurologist, 17 years of practice, expert witness in 11 competency proceedings, conducted a comprehensive 2-hour evaluation. Her conclusion? Mrs. Hale shows no cognitive impairment. Her memory, reasoning, and judgment are fully intact. Carmen paused. Let the silence work. But there's something more concerning, Your Honor. Dr. Kemp filed an amended evaluation claiming a follow-up visit on October 14th. I have a sworn affidavit from a witness who was physically present at Mrs. Hale's residence for 14 consecutive hours on that date. No medical professional visited the property. She placed the affidavit on the bench. Dr. Kemp fabricated a medical evaluation and submitted it to this court. That isn't malpractice, that's fraud. And it's the foundation of the entire petition before you. Hargrove stood. Your Honor, these are serious allegations that— I'm not finished, Mr. Hargrove, Carmen said. She didn't look at him. She looked at the judge. Additionally, Adult Protective Services has opened an active investigation into the petitioner, Kevin Hale, for suspected elder financial exploitation. The investigation has uncovered a pattern of isolation, including providing Mrs. Hale with a phone restricted to a single, outgoing number controlled by the petitioner, financial coercion, and the use of a compromised medical professional to manufacture grounds for a competency proceeding. She placed Sandra Mitchell's preliminary report on the bench. Mrs. Hale's home is valued at $1.4 million following the bypass development. The petitioner has no prior history of involvement in her care. He made no contact for 2 years following the death of his mother, Mrs. Hale's niece, and reappeared only after the property value increased. Carmen straightened. Your Honor, this is not a competency case. This is a theft case dressed in legal clothing. I respectfully move to dismiss. The courtroom was silent. Judge Rivera looked at the documents. She looked at Carmen. She looked at Hargrove. Then she looked at Dorothy. Mrs. Hale. Dorothy stood, slowly, steadily, Bear's hand pressed against the railing behind her. Not touching her, just close enough that she could feel the warmth. Yes, Your Honor. Do you understand the proceedings today? I do. Do you understand what your nephew is requesting? He's requesting the right to take my home and put me in a facility. He's been trying to do this for months. I've said no every time. I'm saying no now. Do you feel that you're able to manage your own affairs? Dorothy lifted her chin. Your Honor, I've managed my own affairs for 90 years. I managed a household, a marriage, a garden, and a grief that would have broken most people. I pay my taxes on time. I balance my checkbook by hand. I know exactly what day it is, who the president is, and what my grandnephew is trying to do to me. She paused. The only thing I couldn't manage was being alone, and I'm not alone anymore. Judge Rivera studied her for a long moment. Then she looked at Kevin. Kevin looked back. His face was composed, but his hands on the table were pressed flat, the way a man presses his hands when he's trying to keep them from shaking. The judge removed her glasses, set them on the bench. I've reviewed the motion to dismiss. I've reviewed Dr. Prescott's evaluation. I've reviewed the APS preliminary findings, and I've reviewed Dr. Kemp's assessments. She paused. I'm granting the motion to dismiss. The petition is denied. Dorothy's knees went weak. Carmen's hand caught her elbow. Behind her, she heard Earl exhale, a long, shuddering breath he'd been holding since they walked through the courthouse doors. Furthermore, Judge Rivera continued, her voice carrying the kind of authority that fills a room the way water fills a container, completely, leaving no gaps. I am referring Dr. Kemp's evaluations to the Montana Board of Medical Examiners for review. The discrepancies between his initial assessment, his amended assessment, and the independent evaluation conducted by Dr. Prescott are deeply troubling. She looked directly at Kevin. Mr. Hale, I want to be very clear. The evidence before me suggests a pattern of conduct that goes well beyond family disagreement. If the APS investigation substantiates the allegations of financial exploitation, you will face consequences far more serious than a dismissed petition. Kevin didn't move, didn't speak. His new lawyer placed a hand on his arm, the universal attorney signal for, do not open your mouth. This case is dismissed with prejudice. Mrs. Hale is free to go. The gavel came down. The sound cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot. Dorothy stood there for a moment. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood in that courtroom, in her blue cardigan, with Carmen on one side and the empty space on her other side that Walter should have filled. And she let it hit her. The weight of it, the relief, the enormity of what had almost happened and what had been stopped. Then she turned around. Bear was standing. Earl was standing, both of them looking at her with eyes that held everything they'd never say out loud. Dorothy walked to Bear. She reached up and placed both hands on his face, her small, wrinkled hands on his weathered, scarred cheeks, and she held him there. You saved my life, she said. Not a whisper, not a dramatic declaration, a simple, factual statement. The same way she'd say the sun rose this morning, or the spruce trees need water. Bear's eyes were wet. His jaw worked. His voice, when it came, was barely a sound. You saved ours first, Ma. You just don't know it yet. Behind them, Kevin stood at the petitioner's table, alone. His lawyer was already packing up. Megan had left the gallery before the gavel finished echoing. The courtroom was emptying around him like water draining from a broken vessel. He looked at Dorothy one last time, and what was left on his face wasn't anger, wasn't calculation, wasn't the cold machinery of a man running a scheme. It was something smaller, something that looked, for just 1 second, like the ghost of a boy who had once been Patricia's son before he became whatever he'd become. Then he turned and walked out of the courtroom. His footsteps echoed on the floor. The door closed behind him. And Dorothy Hale, 90 years old, standing in a courtroom in Billings, Montana, surrounded by men in leather vests who had become her family because she'd had the courage to ask. Dorothy Hale took Bear's arm, walked out into the daylight, and didn't look back. The aftermath came fast. 3 days after Judge Rivera dismissed the case, Sandra Mitchell called Carmen Reyes. What she said made Carmen set down her coffee and close her office door. We subpoenaed Kemp's patient records. And Dorothy Hale wasn't the only one. Carmen gripped the phone. How many? Sandra's voice was steady, but underneath it, the same tightly controlled fury Carmen had heard in Dr. Prescott's office, in Bear's voice, in Annie's shaking hands. The fury of someone who has pulled back a curtain and found something worse than they imagined. 7 elderly patients across 3 counties over the past 2 years. Same pattern every time. A family member contacts Kemp. Kemp conducts a minimal evaluation, 10 minutes, 12 minutes, never more than 15. He files a competency report. The family uses it to obtain power of attorney or initiate guardianship proceedings. Assets get transferred. Homes get sold. The patient gets moved to a facility. Carmen pressed her hand against her forehead. 7 people. 7 that we've found so far. 3 of them are still alive. 2 are in assisted living facilities they don't need. 1 signed away a property worth $800,000 to a grandson who hadn't visited her in 4 years. The other 4 are deceased. Deceased. 2 died within 6 months of being placed. 1 died within a year. The 4th died 3 weeks after her home was sold. Heart failure. Her neighbor told us she stopped eating the day she found out the house was gone. Carmen was silent for 10 seconds. She stared at the wall of her office. The framed degrees, the bar admission certificate, the photograph of her first pro bono client, an 83-year-old man who'd been swindled out of his pension by his own son. That case had been the reason she went into elder law. That case had been the worst thing she'd ever seen. Until now. I'm filing criminal referrals, Sandra said. Kemp, and every family member who participated. But Carmen, I need Dorothy. I need her testimony. She's the strongest witness we have. She's the one who fought back. She's the one the jury will remember. Carmen called Bear. Bear called Dorothy. Dorothy didn't hesitate. When do they need me? It could take months, Dorothy, maybe longer. This is going to be a long fight. I've been fighting for 90 years. What's a few more months? Bear laughed, the kind of laugh that comes out rough because it's pushing past something heavy in the chest. That's my ma. The wheels of justice turned, slowly, the way they always do when the machinery is grinding through something this rotten. But they turned. The Montana Board of Medical Examiners launched a formal investigation into Dr. Leonard Kemp. His medical records were seized. His patient files were audited. Every evaluation he'd conducted in the past 5 years was reviewed, and the deeper they dug, the worse it got. 7 victims became 9. 9 became 12. 12 families gutted. 12 lives boxed up and shipped to places they didn't need to be. A quiet cottage industry of manufactured incompetence, run by a man with a medical license and no conscience. Kemp's license was suspended within 3 months, revoked within 6. He fought it, hired lawyers, filed appeals, claimed his evaluations were conducted in good faith, claimed he was being persecuted, claimed he was a dedicated physician caught in a misunderstanding. The board didn't buy it. Neither did the district attorney. Criminal charges came down in January. 3 counts of fraud, 2 counts of elder abuse, 1 count of filing false documents with the court. Kemp's lawyer negotiated. Kemp refused to negotiate. He went to trial. He sat in a courtroom and listened to 12 jurors hear testimony from the people he'd helped destroy. The families, the neighbors, the caregivers who'd watched helpless as their loved ones were declared incompetent by a man who spent less time evaluating them than most people spend choosing what to eat for lunch. Dorothy testified on a Tuesday afternoon. She wore her blue cardigan. She sat in the witness chair with her hands folded in her lap, looked the jury in the eyes, and told them everything. The 12-minute visit, the questions that didn't matter, the clipboard, the way Kemp never looked her in the eye, not once. He didn't see me, Dorothy said. He saw a number. He saw a signature. He saw a house worth $1.4 million, but he didn't see me. The courtroom was silent. I'm 90 years old, she continued. I've buried a husband and a niece and more friends than I can count. I've survived things that would break people half my age. And a man who spent 12 minutes in my living room decided I couldn't think straight. She paused, looked at Kemp. He wouldn't meet her eyes. I'm here because someone heard me. A waitress in a diner. She heard me when no one else did. And she told someone. And that someone told someone else. And that's the only reason I'm sitting in this chair instead of in a room with a number on the door. Her voice dropped. But there are people who weren't heard. People who signed those papers because they were alone and scared and didn't have anyone to walk across a diner and ask for help. Those people deserve to be in this chair. They can't be, so I'm here for them. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Kemp was sentenced to 14 months in a state facility, a room with a number instead of a name. Bear heard the sentence and said nothing, but Annie saw his face and she understood. 14 months wasn't justice, but it was a start. Kevin Hale was charged separately. Attempted financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a felony in Montana. Megan was charged as a co-conspirator. The evidence was a mountain that Kevin's lawyers couldn't climb over, around, or through. Dorothy's testimony, Annie's affidavit, Carmen's documentation, Sandra's investigation, the phone records, the financial records, the timeline that showed a plan so deliberate, so calculated, so coldly executed that even Kevin's own character witnesses couldn't explain it away. Kevin took a plea deal, 2 years probation, full restitution of all legal costs, a permanent restraining order, a lifetime ban from any fiduciary role over a vulnerable adult. His real estate license was suspended pending review. He and Megan moved to Arizona. They sold their house in Bozeman at a loss. They didn't say goodbye to anyone. 6 months later, Dorothy received a letter. No return address, postmarked Scottsdale. She opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where Kevin had spread his papers, where Carmen had built her case, where 6 bikers drank coffee every Thursday morning, now like it was the most natural thing in the world. The letter contained 2 words, I'm sorry. Dorothy read it. She sat with it for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. The clock on the wall ticked the way it had ticked for 58 years. She thought about Patricia, Kevin's mother, her niece, and wondered what Patricia would say if she could see what her son had become. She thought about whether sorry meant anything when it came in an envelope with no return address, sent by a man who'd only found his conscience after a judge took everything else. She folded the letter, placed it in the drawer next to Walter's old pocket watch, closed the drawer. She never mentioned it again. Annie went back to school. It was Bear who pushed her, not with words. Bear rarely pushed with words. He pushed by showing up at the diner one morning, sitting at the counter, and sliding a brochure across the surface. Montana State University, night classes, social work program. Annie stared at it. I'm a waitress, Bear. You were a waitress. Now you're the woman who made a phone call that saved 12 people. School just gives you a license for what you already are. Annie picked up the brochure. Her hands trembled, not from fear, from the weight of something she'd never allowed herself to want. A future that was bigger than the one she'd been hiding inside for 8 years. She enrolled that fall. Night classes, 3 times a week. She kept working at Rosie's during the day, couldn't afford not to. She studied on her breaks. She wrote papers at midnight. She fell asleep over textbooks and woke up with ink on her cheek and coffee gone cold beside her. It was hard, harder than she'd expected. There were nights she sat on her apartment floor and thought about quitting, thought about the duffel bag and the bus ticket, and all the other times she'd walked away from things that got difficult. Then she'd think about Dorothy standing up in that booth, 90 years old, trembling, walking toward the most dangerous table in the room. If Dorothy could do that, Annie could open a textbook. She graduated 3 years later. The ceremony was on a Saturday in May. Dorothy sat in the front row. She'd insisted. Bear drove her. Boone carried her chair. Earl held an umbrella over her head because the forecast said rain, even though the sky was clear. Jax brought flowers. Colt brought a camera. When Annie's name was called and she crossed the stage, Dorothy stood. Slowly, with Boone's arm to steady her, she rose from her seat. And she clapped, louder than anyone in the auditorium. Her small hands, 93 years old, making more noise than seemed physically possible. Annie looked down from the stage and saw Bear behind her, clapping with those massive hands. Saw the whole row of them, leather vests under sport coats they'd bought for the occasion, looking wildly out of place and completely, perfectly where they belonged. Annie cried, right there on the stage, diploma in one hand, the other pressed against her mouth. She didn't care. She'd spent enough of her life pretending things didn't touch her. She went to work for Adult Protective Services the following month. Same office as Sandra Mitchell. Same desk Sandra had used when she'd first opened Dorothy's case. Some things come full circle. Some circles take years to close, but they close. 5 years after that Thursday in the diner, Dorothy Hale turned 95 on a Tuesday in June. By the time she woke, her porch was already full. Bear brought the sunrise. He'd been there since 4 a.m., sitting in the rocking chair with coffee, watching the Bridger Mountains turn gold. Boone brought a chair he'd built with his own hands. Wide, sturdy, with armrests sanded smooth enough for old hands. From walnut he'd been curing in his garage for 6 months. Earl brought flowers from the garden. Dorothy's garden. The one they'd all replanted together that first spring. The one that grew tomatoes and green beans and sunflowers just like Walter's used to. Jax brought a cake he'd tried to bake from scratch. Colt brought a backup cake from the bakery in town because he'd seen Jax's version and loved Dorothy too much to let her suffer. Stonewall brought nothing. He stood on the porch, arms crossed, and said 2 words. Happy birthday. From Stonewall, that was a symphony. Dorothy stood in her doorway and looked at these men, road-worn, leather-clad, scarred and imperfect, and profoundly, stubbornly present. I asked for a son for 1 day, she said softly. I didn't expect 6 for a lifetime. Bear swallowed hard. His eyes were wet. He let them be. We protect our supply of blueberry cobbler, Ma, he said. His voice cracked at the edges. He let it crack. Colt had moved into the spare bedroom 2 years earlier, the room that had been empty since Walter died. It happened after Dorothy took a fall, reaching for a bowl on a high shelf. Nothing broken, but the bruise on her hip took weeks to fade, and the fear in her eyes took longer. Colt showed up the next day with a duffel bag and a toothbrush and said, I'm staying until that shelf gets lowered. The shelf got lowered within an hour. Colt never left. 2 toothbrushes in the bathroom cup. Such a small thing, such an enormous thing. The entire distance between alone and not alone, measured in the width of a toothbrush holder. Dorothy survived a bout of pneumonia that winter, bad enough to put her in the hospital for 9 days. Every night, a biker sat beside her bed. They worked shifts. Bear took the first 2 nights. Boone took the third and fourth. Earl read to her. Jax smuggled in cobbler from the diner and got caught by a nurse and didn't care. Colt slept in the chair beside her bed and woke every time her breathing changed. The nurses were uneasy at first. Leather vests under fluorescent lights, patches and tattoos in a ward full of monitors and IV lines. By the third day, the unease was gone. They saw what Dorothy had always seen, what Annie had seen that Thursday morning, what Judge Rivera had seen in her courtroom, what Sandra Mitchell had written in her final report. Tenderness wearing armor. Love dressed in leather. Family built from nothing but the decision to show up. When Dorothy came home, all 6 were waiting. The house was warm. Colt had made soup. Someone, she never found out who, had placed a single sunflower in a vase on the kitchen table. She stood in her doorway and pressed her hand to her heart. "Come inside," she said. "I'm not having my boys standing in the cold." They went inside. Boone ducked under the doorframe. Jax knocked over the salt shaker. Stonewall caught it before it hit the ground and didn't say a word. Dorothy sat at the head of the table in the house her husband built 58 years ago. She looked at the faces around her. 6 men who had no reason to be there except the only reason that ever matters. They chose her, and she had chosen them first. A waitress whispered. A biker listened. An old woman walked toward the most dangerous table in the room, and in doing so, she found what she had lost, and what they didn't know they were missing. A family, built not from blood, not from obligation, not from law, but from the simple, stubborn, world-altering decision to give a damn about someone who needed it. Elder abuse is real. It is quiet. It hides behind polite smiles and legal folders and the word care used as a weapon. It happens every single day to people who have no Dorothy's courage, no Annie's ears, no Bear's hands, no Carmen's briefcase, no Sandra's badge. But here is what this story proves. You don't need authority to act. You don't need a badge. You don't need money. You don't need permission. You don't need to be big or powerful or connected or brave. You need to hear someone, really hear them, and then you need to stand up. Dorothy Hale walked across a diner at 90 years old, trembling, terrified, with nothing left but a question and the desperate last chance hope that strangers might be kinder than family. They were. Because sometimes the most dangerous looking men in the room become the safest place to land. Sometimes the smallest voice becomes the one that changes everything. Not with a shout, not with power, not with money or authority or force, with a whisper. Just for today, be my son. They never stopped.